In April of 1865, the United States was a nation experiencing an overwhelming, chaotic collision of emotions. 4 years of brutal, unprecedented civil war had finally come to an end with General Robert E. Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Yet, the initial euphoria of peace was almost immediately shattered by the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln just days later. The country was plunged into a state of profound mourning and high anxiety, obsessed with the desperate manhunt for John Wilkes Booth. But far from the political centers of Washington and the battlefields of Virginia, another massive, silent tragedy was unfolding in the Deep South. For months, the crumbling Confederate government had been holding tens of thousands of Union prisoners of war in hellish, disease-ridden prison camps like Andersonville in Georgia and Cahaba in Alabama. These camps were notorious for their complete lack of food, clean water, and basic sanitation. The men held there had been reduced to walking skeletons. Many were suffering from severe dysentery, scurvy, and malaria. When the war ended, these gaunt, traumatized survivors were finally released. They were marched and transported by train to the city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, which had become a major gathering point for repatriated Union soldiers. For these men, the nightmare was over. They had survived the absolute worst horrors the war had to offer, and they wanted nothing more than to go home to their families in Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, and Tennessee. The United States government, faced with the monumental logistical challenge of moving tens of thousands of sick men north, turned to the private sector. The Mississippi River was the superhighway of the era, and the government offered highly lucrative contracts to civilian steamboat captains to transport the soldiers upriver to Cairo, Illinois. The War Department agreed to pay $5 per enlisted man and $10 per officer. In the mid-19th century, this was an absolute fortune. A steamboat captain could make thousands of dollars in a single trip if he packed enough men onto his decks. It created a ruthless, hyper-competitive gold rush among the riverboat operators, where profit quickly became the only consideration. Enter the SS Sultana. The Sultana was a massive, wooden-hulled sidewheel steamboat, measuring 260 feet long. It was relatively new, built in 1863, and was designed for the lucrative cotton trade between St. Louis and New Orleans. It was considered a fast, state-of-the-art vessel. The boat was commanded by Captain James Cass Mason, a highly experienced riverman who had a reputation for speed and a deep ambition to maximize his profits. On April 23, 1865, the Sultana was steaming downriver toward Vicksburg when the chief engineer noticed a severe problem. One of the boat's 4 massive tubular boilers was leaking. The intense heat and pressure had caused a seam to bulge outward, creating a dangerous weakness in the iron metal. When the boat docked in Vicksburg, Captain Mason brought a local mechanic aboard to inspect the damage. The mechanic took one look at the bulging boiler and delivered bad news. He told Captain Mason that the boiler was unsafe and needed a massive repair. Specifically, 2 large sheets of iron needed to be entirely cut out and replaced, a process that would take several days to complete. Captain Mason knew that if he kept his boat tied up at the docks for days, he would lose the lucrative government transport contract to other steamboats that were already arriving in Vicksburg to pick up the prisoners. Mason absolutely refused the thorough repair. He ordered the mechanic to simply hammer the bulge flat and rivet a single, thin patch of metal over the seam. The mechanic strongly warned against it, explaining that a temporary patch would never withstand the intense steam pressure required to push against the river's current. But Mason pulled rank and insisted. Reluctantly, the mechanic patched the boiler. With the quick fix complete, the corrupt quartermaster officers in Vicksburg began loading the Union prisoners onto the Sultana. The steamboat had a legal carrying capacity of 376 passengers and crew. Driven by the enormous bounty paid per head, the military officials and Captain Mason ignored all safety limits. They packed the emaciated, exhausted soldiers onto every square inch of the vessel. They filled the lower decks, the boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the Texas deck. Men were sleeping on the stairways, in the engine room, and on the roof of the main cabin. By the time the boarding was finished, there were approximately 2,400 people crammed onto a wooden boat designed for fewer than 400. The overcrowding was so extreme that the wooden decks began to physically sag under the immense weight of the men. The crew had to hastily install heavy wooden stanchions, essentially massive wooden pillars, to prop up the upper decks and prevent them from collapsing before the boat even left the dock. The Sultana was incredibly top-heavy, dangerously unbalanced, and packed tighter than a slave ship. But the soldiers did not complain. They were sitting shoulder to shoulder, playing cards, sharing whatever food they had, and singing songs. They were going home. On April 24th, the Sultana finally cast off her mooring lines and pushed out into the Mississippi River. The timing of the journey could not have been worse. The spring of 1865 saw one of the most severe floods in the recorded history of the Mississippi River. The melting snow from the northern states, combined with heavy spring rains, had swollen the river to terrifying proportions. In some places, the river had broken its banks and was over 3 miles wide. The current was an incredibly fast, freezing, roaring torrent of muddy water filled with entire uprooted trees and floating debris. To push a massively overloaded, top-heavy boat against this historically powerful current required maximum power. The engineers in the hull of the Sultana shoveled coal into the furnaces at a frantic pace, pushing the boilers to their absolute structural limits to generate enough steam. The pressure gauge hovered constantly in the danger zone. Every time the boat navigated around a sharp bend in the river, the top-heavy mass of 2,000 men leaning into the turn caused the vessel to tilt severely to one side. When a steamboat of that design tilted, the water inside the interconnected boilers would rush to the lower side. The upper boilers would briefly run dry and superheat the empty iron. When the boat leveled out, the water would violently slosh back onto the glowing, superheated metal, creating an instant, massive spike in steam pressure. It was a ticking time bomb. Despite the groaning timbers and the overworked engines, the Sultana made steady progress north. On April 26th, the boat arrived in Memphis, Tennessee. The crew unloaded heavy hogsheads of sugar from the cargo hold in the bottom of the ship. Unloading this heavy ballast from the bottom made the boat even more top-heavy and unstable. A few hours later, a photographer on the riverbank took a picture of the Sultana. In the photograph, you can clearly see a solid, black mass of humanity covering every railing, roof, and deck of the steamboat. Just before midnight on April 26th, the Sultana left Memphis, bound for Cairo, Illinois. The night was pitch black, cold, and rainy. Most of the exhausted soldiers, wrapped in whatever thin blankets they could find, had fallen asleep on the crowded decks. The only sounds were the massive wooden paddle wheels churning the floodwaters and the deep, rhythmic breathing of the steam engines. At 2 a.m. on April 27th, when the Sultana was approximately 7 miles north of Memphis, the inevitable happened. The patched, weakened boiler simply could not contain the relentless pressure any longer. It violently ruptured. The sudden release of pressure triggered a catastrophic chain reaction, instantly causing 2 of the adjacent boilers to explode simultaneously. The explosive force of 3 massive, high-pressure steam boilers detonating in the confined hull of the wooden ship was equivalent to a massive bomb. Because the decks above the boilers were packed solid with human beings, the blast had nowhere to go but up and out at a 45-degree angle. The explosion instantly obliterated the center of the ship. Hundreds of sleeping soldiers were instantly vaporized by superheated steam or blown to pieces by flying shrapnel. The blast tore entirely through the boiler deck, the hurricane deck, and the pilot house. The physical destruction of the ship's superstructure caused the two massive, towering iron smokestacks to lose their support. They toppled backward, crushing the densely packed decks below, pinning dozens of men under tons of red-hot iron. The blast completely separated the bow of the ship from the stern. The horror of the explosion was immediately followed by the terror of fire. The detonation had scattered the glowing coals from the furnaces all over the splintered dry wood of the shattered vessel. Fanned by the wind on the river, the wood instantly ignited. Within minutes, the center of the Sultana was a roaring, inescapable inferno. The men who survived the initial blast woke up in a literal nightmare. They found themselves on a burning, sinking ship in the middle of a pitch-black, freezing, flooded river. Panic erupted instantly. Men who had been sleeping peacefully moments before were now screaming, running blindly through the smoke, and trampling each other in a desperate bid to escape the flames. As the fire aggressively consumed the remaining decks, the surviving soldiers were forced to the edges of the boat. The heat became so intense that the skin began to blister on the men's faces. Realizing that staying on the boat meant burning to death, the soldiers began to jump into the freezing Mississippi River by the hundreds. The water offered no safe haven. Most people in the 19th century did not know how to swim, and these men were severely weakened by months of starvation in Confederate prisons. The river instantly became a chaotic, swirling mass of drowning, screaming men fighting for survival. Desperate, non-swimming soldiers grabbed onto anyone near them, dragging strong swimmers beneath the murky, freezing water. Men fought brutally over anything that could float. Shattered doors, wooden window frames, unrolled bales of hay, and barrels. Some survivors managed to stay afloat using incredible, desperate ingenuity. The explosion had blown several of the ship's cavalry horses and mules into the river. A few soldiers survived by grabbing onto the tails of the terrified swimming animals, letting the beasts tow them toward the flooded shoreline. Other men survived by grabbing onto the dead, floating bodies of their comrades, using corpses as human life rafts in the pitch-black water. Back on the remains of the Sultana, the situation was completely hopeless. The wind shifted, blowing the massive wall of flames backward over the stern of the boat, where hundreds of men had retreated to escape the fire. With the flames rushing toward them, the deck beneath their feet finally gave way. The entire rear section of the ship collapsed into the burning hull, taking hundreds of men down into the furnace. The blazing wreckage of the Sultana, completely unsteerable and abandoned by its surviving crew, drifted slowly downriver toward Memphis, illuminating the dark sky like a massive, floating funeral pyre. The rescue effort was tragically slow. The sheer width of the flooded river meant that the people on the shore could barely see the burning ship, and those who did assumed it was a controlled fire on a levee. The first vessel to reach the scene was a southbound steamboat called the Bostonia II. The crew of the Bostonia intercepted the mass of floating survivors floating downstream. They immediately began throwing everything they could pry loose overboard for the drowning men to grab onto. They tossed chairs, tables, doors, and ropes into the freezing water. They managed to pull dozens of men aboard, but they were forced to carefully navigate through the massive field of survivors to avoid crushing men under their own paddle wheels. As the burning wreckage of the Sultana drifted past the Memphis waterfront around 3 a.m., the city finally woke up to the disaster. Every available steamboat, skiff, and military gunboat stationed in the port was mobilized for rescue. But by the time they reached the main debris field, many of the men who had survived the blast and the fire had already succumbed to the freezing temperatures of the water. Hypothermia claimed hundreds of lives in the dark. When dawn finally broke over the Mississippi River, the sunlight revealed a scene of unimaginable devastation. The riverbanks, for miles south of the explosion site, were littered with the dead and the dying. Because the river was flooded far beyond its normal banks, many soldiers who had managed to swim to what they thought was the shore actually found themselves trapped in the submerged tops of massive oak and cottonwood trees, sitting in freezing water, waiting for rescue boats to pluck them from the branches. The hospitals and public buildings of Memphis were rapidly overflowing with severely burned, freezing, and traumatized men. The citizens of Memphis, a city that had been bitterly hostile to the Union just a year prior, turned out in massive numbers to help the dying Union soldiers, donating blankets, food, and medical supplies to the very men they had recently considered their mortal enemies. The official death toll of the Sultana explosion has never been perfectly determined, primarily because the corrupt officers in Vicksburg never kept an accurate manifest of the men they crammed onto the ship. The United States Customs Service recorded the official death toll at 1,195. However, modern historians and researchers, analyzing pension records and military archives, estimate that the true number of dead is between 1,700 and 1,800 people. Over 200 of the men who were pulled from the river alive died in the following days from severe burns, hypothermia, or pneumonia. To put this into perspective, the sinking of the RMS Titanic, universally recognized as the most famous maritime disaster in history, resulted in the loss of 1,517 lives. The explosion of the Sultana killed hundreds more, making it the deadliest maritime disaster in the history of the United States. Yet, when the news of the explosion finally reached the National Telegraph wires, it barely made the front pages of the newspapers. The tragedy was completely eclipsed by the massive, overwhelming news cycle of the end of the Civil War. Just the day before the explosion, Union cavalry had cornered and killed John Wilkes Booth in a burning barn in Virginia. The nation was entirely consumed with the details of the assassin's death, the ongoing trial of his co-conspirators, and the massive cross-country funeral train carrying Abraham Lincoln's body back to Illinois. The country was suffering from profound tragedy fatigue. After 4 years of reading casualty lists where thousands of men died in a single afternoon at places like Gettysburg and Antietam, the loss of another 1,800 men on a riverboat barely registered in the public consciousness. The pursuit of justice for the men who died on the Sultana was equally disappointing. Captain James Cass Mason, the man who refused to properly repair the boiler and allowed his boat to be massively overloaded, was killed in the explosion, denying the survivors the satisfaction of seeing him stand trial. The military launched an investigation and convened a court-martial. They focused entirely on the corrupt quartermasters in Vicksburg who had organized the loading of the ship. Captain Frederick Speed, the officer primarily responsible for putting over 2,000 men onto the Sultana, was found guilty of gross negligence by a military tribunal. However, his conviction was ultimately overturned by the Judge Advocate General of the Army, who ruled that Speed had not technically ordered the men onto the boat, but had merely facilitated the process. Speed was honorably discharged from the Army and faced no civilian criminal consequences. The mechanic who had performed the faulty patch job on the boiler was never formally charged. No one was ever held legally accountable for the greatest loss of life on a ship in American history. The physical remains of the Sultana were eventually swallowed by the shifting mud of the Mississippi River. Decades later, the river changed its course entirely, leaving the wreckage of the steamboat buried 30 feet deep beneath an ordinary soybean field in Arkansas, roughly 2 miles from the modern banks of the river. The story of the SS Sultana remains one of the darkest, most tragic ironies of American history. 1,800 young men survived the bloodiest war the continent had ever seen. They survived the brutal, starving, disease-ridden nightmare of the worst prison camps in existence. They had endured unimaginable suffering and finally won their freedom, only to be killed on their way home by the mundane, reckless greed of a few men looking to make a quick profit on a steamboat contract. It is a story of profound survival and catastrophic betrayal, a devastating footnote buried in the shadows of the Civil War's end.